NATO Summit 2024, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event hosted by the Warsaw Institute, and I am pleased to introduce my two guests today. First of all, Benjamin Bartos is with me. Good afternoon, Benjamin. Benjamin, we cannot hear you.
Apologies, I forgot to turn it off. Yes, no, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. And I look forward very much to the panel discussion.
Thank you. And my second guest, Michael Werbowski, expert Warsaw Institute, same as Benjamin. Good afternoon, Michael.
Yes, good afternoon over there in Europe. Pleasure to be with you as well, Maciej.
Thank you very much. Our event is organized with support of National Institute of Freedom. And gentlemen, last week there was a NATO summit that was organized in Washington. Now we have really tough and surprising geopolitical times. So the summit brought a lot of new and maintained a lot that already has been done. So my first question to you is, looking at the outcomes of the NATO summit, we can see that the countries maintained the support to Ukraine. And I would like to ask you first general question, how would you assess the NATO's decisions in terms of support for Ukraine? As well, I'd like to hear your opinion whether we should give to Ukraine more of a direct military support. Benjamin, the floor is yours. We'll start with you.
Thank you very much. Well, the NATO summit had some very positive developments, especially when it comes to the training of Ukrainian troops and NATO presence in Europe. Now we actually have a liaison directly in Kyiv for NATO to channel their discussion through. And the NSATU was also established to facilitate the training of Ukrainian personnel to keep on their fight with Russia. And I think that's a very positive development, as the training of manpower is one of the most important issues that needs to be addressed. But also, additionally, regarding direct support, I think this is a very good division of where the West needs to be currently, because we need to draw the line of direct confrontation and no direct confrontation. I think what we're currently doing in trying to facilitate Ukraine being as potent as it possibly can is a very good trajectory. Although I do think that the lethal aid that we're providing should be increased so they can be a more powerful force against the Russians. But I think currently, as of right now, the NATO summit held a very good discussion on actually getting together a consensus and drawing together the platform necessary to facilitate this through NATO. Because until now, it has been all over the place. But finally, now we have a centralized channel through NATO to facilitate the training of Ukrainian people. And I can't emphasize this enough. It is of paramount importance that the more Ukrainian people or more Ukrainian soldiers are trained, because, well, manpower shortages are a very big thing in Ukraine. And the more one soldier is capable of, the better it is for all of Ukraine as well. So I think right now, the current NATO summit had some very good discussions, and it's a very positive trajectory.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So after the summit, we are putting this emphasis of training of Ukrainian troops. And now I would like to give the floor to Michael Werbowski with the same question about sort of assessment of NATO summit's outcomes towards Ukraine. And shall we expect more military involvement, or this drawing the line mentioned by Benjamin is enough as for now?
Yes, thank you very much, Maciej. To sort of follow up on Benjamin's points, let me just check my note that the NSATU NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine program, which was announced at the summit in Washington, gives sort of Ukraine a prospect, a roadmap, if you want, for potential membership. The only problem that I have with this is well, there are several kind of caveats. We all know that the last two, expansion waves, if you want to call it, was in Scandinavia. We saw Finland and Sweden join the alliance. Now, these are very wealthy countries. They're solid democracies. I'm sure some of us visited these countries, and we know that they're very, very adept as far as their military industrial complex, if I may use that term, is concerned. The Swedes make outstanding submarines uh, that are used by the U.S. Navy. Finland has some of the best soldiers in Scandinavia. Now they've contributed something very positive to the alliance. With Ukraine, we have to ask ourselves, we being those, the top brass in the Pentagon and the technocrats and policymakers in Brussels, what is Ukraine going to contribute to NATO? If you join a club, it's not just about membership. You're supposed to bring something to the alliance. And I'm concerned. I'm not exactly 100% sure that extending membership to Ukraine will be beneficial for NATO, will be beneficial for cohesion of the alliance. Now, why do I say that? Because I've covered expansions of previous expansion. Let's use the case of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, which joined, I believe it was 1997. These countries were given solid, ironclad guarantees that they would join the alliance. We all knew at the time. Even when I attended some of the Senate Foreign Relations gatherings in Washington, and Dr. Brzezinski was there, and a certain Senator Biden was there, was chairman. You knew that it's going to be a done deal. And Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, um, uh, and Hungary, they were those Czechs and Slovaks split, by the way. So we had four new members. They knew that there would be an absolute at the end of the game membership, and that gives you an incentive to do everything possible to join. Uh, and at the same time, the support and sponsorship was there of the United States and Western European allies. With Ukraine, we don't see there's a kind of a carrot dangling. Yes, Ukraine, you will join, but let's face it. I don't want to sound negative, but the Ukrainians did not receive their official invitation to join. So that means that there are reservations, within the alliance as to NATO compatibility. That means the armaments, the training that's required for Ukraine to join. Certain democratic criteria have to be met. And so, yes, they are gearing up for NATO membership, and the sort of sponsorship program that's NS ATU is a kind of a bridge or a baby step towards membership. But with Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, there was no question they would join. It was not if, but when. So with Ukraine, there's not only a when, but if they will actually join. And in a war situation, preparing for NATO membership, when we don't know what kind of territorial arrangement will be made with Russia at some point in order for Ukraine to join, it adds to the uncertainty, and it makes membership very difficult. And like I said, if a member wants to join, they have to strengthen the alliance, like Sweden and Finland, but not weaken it.
Thank you very much, Michael. You've mentioned the topic of NATO enlargement with Ukraine. During the summit, NATO affirmed Ukraine's irreversible path to membership, even though the official invitation is not yet here. So let's have some predictions with that one. I will give the floor to Benjamin, and I would like to ask you, how feasible is NATO membership for Ukraine in current geopolitical tensions? And can we expect it in the next 5, 10 years, or will wait even longer for that?
Thank you. Well, the trajectory for Ukraine joining NATO is rather precarious, to put it in the nicest way possible. There's intrinsic geopolitical tensions tied to Ukraine joining NATO, which aren't exactly new. I mean, when back in 2010s, Ukraine had pro-Western ambitions. Those were very quickly stomped out by the Russians. So when we look at this in the future, now obviously there's the war, but that also complicates it significantly. So is Ukraine going to join NATO next year or the year after? I would say that's very unlikely. However, I do agree with the statement that they are on an irreversible trajectory to join NATO. However, the timeline is the main question of that. When exactly is that going to happen? And I think one of the most important things for NATO to accept Ukraine is for this conflict to have some kind of resolution. It's because no member state right now, all of them, are gonna willingly commit troops and or economic prowess to this fight to have a physical confrontation. And that's what this would involve if Ukraine were to join right now. So the first step for that would be the resolution of the conflict. But that does put Ukraine on a very nice track to joining NATO, but that does leave the very big open-ended question of how the war ends and everything. But irregardless of how it ends, they will join NATO. So I think that's an absolute statement on my behalf. They will end up joining NATO. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. As Michael said, I mean, the training wise, the armaments wise that they're using, the military industrial complex that they currently have, whether it would be compatible with that of the fashion and style that we use in the collective West. These are all questions that would have to be explored. I mean, the most of the munitions that the Ukrainians use is Soviet style munitions. And there would have to be a massive replacement of the type of platforms and systems that the Ukrainians use. So in the short term, no, unfortunately. But in the long term, I think it is an absolute statement that they will end up joining NATO. It's just yet again back to the question of the war. How and when will it end? After that, absolutely.
Thank you. So Ukraine on track in long-term perspective to join the alliance. And Michael, do you have anything to add more to this topic of NATO enlargement with Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. Again, to sort of um, comment on Benjamin's points, that in the best case scenario, in the best of all possible world, on such and such a date, Ukraine will be a member. Okay, let's go with that. But I do have some concerns again on the NATO membership cohesion side, in terms of NATO's capability to engage against its enemies, and we know who those enemies are. We'll maybe discuss it later. What concerns me, listening to experts, reading some material on this, is we've seen a depletion of domestic armaments in the United States, in Western Europe. France, for instance, has a very capable military force, but it's sending all these weapons to Ukraine. The UK is sending weapons to Ukraine. The United States is sending weapons to Ukraine, which is all fine and good. But the readiness and a capability to face a potential, uh, you know, uh, axis of two or three or four hostile states, which are very well armed, and some of them are nuclear, nuclear states in the sense that they have nuclear capability. I'm concerned that we mustn't pour all of our eggs into the Ukraine basket, and we have to keep the domestic military strong. And I'm a little bit concerned that it's weakening as time goes by. The other issue I want to just quickly slip in, the NATO EU tandem or dual. I can't seem to understand that, okay, EU is going to somehow, carry the burden of continuing the war in Ukraine if the United States, let's say, backs off under a new administration. So will it be the European Union in charge of a policy towards a military, reaching will they devise a military strategy? Will it be NATO that's going to be uh, the main initiator of a continued engagement in Ukraine? Will the EU have its say? This is confusing. We're not sure. The other thing is NATO is a bloated bureaucracy now, very similar to the EU. And bloated democracy with depleted weaponry, it makes us look weak in the eyes of our enemies. So if Ukraine joins, we'll all be quite amazed, and maybe it could happen. But from here on until then, we have to be careful not to fragment the alliance and not to weaken it in order to bring Ukraine in.
Thank you very much, Michael. Gentlemen, now let's move to another fantastic and interesting topic, which is the NATO eastern flank. During the summit, we found out that many investments will be done over the NATO eastern flank countries, for example, Poland, and the flank itself will be strengthened more and more by the alliance. So my question to you is, in that regard, should NATO prioritize more the eastern flank over the rest of its activities, or is this prioritized enough and we have enough support for this part of the alliance in regards of conflict beyond eastern border? Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, the eastern flank is of incredible importance to the alliance. That is a fact that just has to be stated. It is where the hybrid warfare between Belarus goes on the border on an almost continuous basis. Videos are pouring in about border confrontations between the border on Poland and Belarus. And that begs the question, I mean, what is the threat assessment for that region? And I actually have to say that if we draw the eastern flank now, looking at NATO's new borders, especially stretching all the way from Finland, then the eastern flank in its aggregate is a massive territorial opportunity as much as it is a liability. And I think that looking at NATO's purpose, which was to counter the eastern threat, it is something that we just can't take the emphasis away from. That is what this alliance was created to do. And I don't think there's such a thing for NATO as to reorientate elsewhere, as that is NATO's purpose. It was in quite a crisis after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But now I think NATO benefits from an understanding of what its objective is, what its role is, what its mission is supposed to be. And therefore, going back to the eastern flank, I mean, we don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to happen. We really don't. But looking at all the possibilities and outcomes, I think there is a need to maintain a contingent, a readiness towards anything that might happen on the Eastern Front. And I absolutely mean anything. And also, when including the eastern flank, I always like to include the Arctic aspect of it, because I just draw a straight line from north to south and then call that the Eastern Front. And I think combining all those threats that might be faced along this geographically drawn line, in a sense, I don't really think there's anywhere else for NATO to reorientate. There's always been arguments that NATO should maybe focus on Asia or China to a greater extent. I vehemently disagree with that position. I don't think it's NATO's purpose and or role to be concerned with those things. It should take it into a strategic view, but its position, in this sense, speaking strictly about NATO, should be about maintaining the security of our eastern border, which at times, as I yet again said, with the hybrid warfares, comes into question. And ever since the war has gone on, there's been several instances of rockets going eerily close, and if not into Poland in one instance as well. So I think that the readiness has to be maintained. There needs to be continuous investment, but not only into the eastern flank. We have to look at it what supports our force projection, our force posture on the eastern flank. And that was a separate segment in a fact sheet released by the White House. They summarized it as supporting the defense industry. And I think that is really the most crucial takeaway here, as I believe that if we want to do any sort of military buildup, we need to look at the logistic aspect of it. We need to treat this as an economics problem. You can't just magically fabricate 3, 4 factories and then say produce shells or produce tanks or whatever you want. No, there is the economical aspect of it, of building up the educated manpower, of having the capital investment to it. And I think that if we put that into the grander picture of the Eastern flank, I think the current position of NATO is becoming increasingly aware of the situation that it's in, and in a positive sense, where it realizes that in order to maintain both the values that we hold and the security, we need to look back and say, okay, what are the intrinsic elements, the basic foundations that guarantees the security, the fact that we can project this security both outwards and inwards. And that's the economic aspect of it. So I think that it is very important. It should not redirect. That is NATO's mission. And we should keep looking to build the sustainability of our force posture on the eastern flank, to make it more reliant and to also make it more resilient, as sabotage has been a thing recently very well used as well by the Russians in certain European member states, such as in Germany or the UK. So I think building the resilience of our logistical supply chains in the grander sense of the military industrial complex supporting the eastern flank, it's great the way that we're going right now. And this outlook shouldn't really be changed or altered with much.
Thank you very much. So building resilience, emphasis on economic aspect as crucial topics here. And thank you for bringing up the topic of Polish-Belarusian border. This is still a really, really crucial topic for Polish security, as today and in general, almost every day, we are struggling with numerous attempts of illegal border crossings, as well as attacks on our soldiers and border guards. So this is really, really tough topic to deal with. But now coming back to Eastern flank and its importance and strengthening it by NATO, I'd like to give the floor to Michael Werbowski to share his views and insights on that situation.
Yeah, let's just elaborate on what Benjamin said, that, before I make two or three other points. On China, I don't think that should be a priority for NATO. I think we have to keep some kind of a focus on what's going on in the transatlantic realm. What's going to happen with China? We'll discuss this maybe later in this um, three-way analysis, but I think we have to prioritize the eastern flank. There's no doubt from a Polish perspective that Poland is on the front lines of the conflict. You have the border with Belarus. You have to secure the border with Ukraine. Speaking of securing the border with Ukraine, let me just put this out. There's talk in Germany of a safe zone in Galicia and Western Ukraine, where my grandparents came from. And we know there was some tensions between Poles and Ukrainians there in the Second World War. But let's say, let's imagine a scenario where a safe zone, which is a nice term for a buffer zone or cordon sanitaire, is established by Polish forces, by the Slovaks, perhaps Romanians and Hungarians, where the situation where a vacuum is avoided. Okay, we don't know how the Russians would react, but to have this buffer zone in place I think, is something that NATO commanders should keep in mind. And Poland would have a very, I think, crucial role in establishing this buffer zone. Why a buffer zone? Well, first you create air defense, then you might send some battalions in, or you know the possibility of at least creating a tampon between Kiev and the Polish border. Okay, why would the NATO commanders think of this? Why would German MPs consider this? Well, because we don't want to see a huge influx of Ukrainians fleeing from the eastern side to the west. This would create chaos in the EU because that's where they would be headed. We already see the pressure that Poland is under on the Belarus-Polish border. We don't want to see that replicated with the Ukrainian-Polish border either. So if NATO member troops do go into that part of Western Ukraine to secure a buffer zone, why not? It's better than leaving it as a vacuum in a country which is unfortunately losing the war, in a country which is outmanned and outgunned by the enemy. So that is something I think we in the West or the NATO top brass may be considering. The other thing is the Arctic. I know this is something that perhaps escapes some of the analysts at NATO, but we also have to make sure that we can secure the Arctic. And the Scandinavians are doing their job, but we, as Poland, new member states, along with the United States, we have China and Russia don't get control of the Arctic Passage seaways. This is crucial for NATO's future to secure that. And to put all our eggs into the Ukraine basket while neglecting the Arctic, I think would be very erroneous and a big mistake for NATO. So I think in terms of China, Russia, the mobilization of manpower, military weaponry, as well, naval ships, and so forth. I'm not a military expert, but to make sure that the Arctic does not become a Chinese-Russian sphere of influence or playground, that we have to keep in mind, and that should be a very important priority for NATO.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll stay with you for the next question. You've mentioned the topic of China. China was broadly criticized during NATO summit for enabling Russia's war activities against Ukraine. So my question to you is whether NATO should somehow differently address its concerns towards Chinese support to Russia, or should NATO, and does NATO have any tools to somehow indirectly react to that, so China would lower its support to Russia? Is there any possibility for NATO to lower Chinese support towards Russia?
Okay, on that question, and thank you, Matze, for bringing China into this game, in the geopolitical chess game. First of all, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think we are beyond the possibility of, driving a wedge between Russia and China. And I'll explain what I mean. I was in Russia, in Moscow, in 2017 for some academic studies, if you will. And I was amazed to see all of these Chinese students with Russian students, and the Russians are learning Mandarin, and the Chinese are learning Russian, and this cooperation, I think it's a done deal. We will not be able, like during the Cold War, when the United States was able to distance the Soviet Union from China. Today, Russia and China, I think, are inextricably linked, if I may say. What we can do is continue signing these bilateral security agreements, like with Ukraine. Every member of NATO has signed some bilateral security agreement as a kind of a backdoor membership, maybe an alternative to full membership. What we can do is concentrate on AUKUS, the Australian, UK, US alliance in Asia and Pacific. You know, sort of try to contain China. The United States as a superpower was able to contain the Soviet Union, the USSR in the Cold War. It's going to be hard to contain China because, in my view, China, I'm going to come out of the closet and say it. I think there's the biggest rival to the United States and possibly the biggest threat to Western might and influence in the world. China is a global power. It's a rising global power. We have to accept it. It's a military power. It's a nuclear power. It's a diplomatic, economic, financial power. How we deal with China is of course the most important issue that'll come up after the elections and whoever is elected. And NATO, if NATO wants to become a global kind of anti-China alliance, I think they're gonna lose that's losing the emphasis on keeping stability and security in Europe. China is a threat in Europe. There's no doubt about it. But NATO should concentrate on, rebuffing China's influence in Europe, in the EU, rather than go to the other side of the world and sort of try to, shadow box with China. That I don't think is a good thing. Yes, uh, um, countering influence, intelligence using NATO intelligence. Member states should use all their capabilities to counter China's influence and infiltration in Western Europe. But as Benjamin said, going to look for, cruising for a bruising, if I may say, with China, I don't think NATO should do that.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing your views with us. Now we are moving to Benjamin with the same question. China, as one of the biggest rivals for US, indirectly supporting Russia, having influence in CEE, how can NATO address Chinese support for Russia without escalating any tensions on geopolitical area?
Thank you. I mean, I'll go right out and say it. I don't think NATO has a role against China, but I will second what Michael said, is that NATO should look at the Chinese influence, which is already readily available in Europe. There's been ports that have been sold in majority to the Chinese. The economic influence that the Chinese possess in Europe, and of course America as well, is enormous. Most of our manufacturing jobs are already outsourced. And I bring this up for one specific reason. If we want to have any hopes in any future engagement, we can't really sustain a long-term war without having the industrial basis to support ourselves. And currently, we've managed to offshore all of that production into China. It's like most of the heavy industries that both the US and Europe used to pride themselves on have enlarged, or to some degree along the supply chain, been offshore to China or other countries that are frighteningly close within the Chinese sphere of influence. So I think that would be the first logical step for NATO is, as Michael said, use the intelligence that the member states have available. And in this, I'll also include the US, of course, naturally, using that intelligence to stamp out Chinese influence in Europe. It's like once you've cleaned up your own garden, then you can go and start nagging somebody else about theirs. So that's what I see NATO being able to focus on with regards to China. I don't think there's anything that they can directly do when it comes to the Chinese supporting the Russians. I think it was very well said by Michael that they are inexorably connected. It's a relationship which was forced out of convenience. The Russians need to sell their energy to someone, And the Chinese need energy, which they would otherwise get from the Gulf states in majority through the Straits of Malacca. However, that is a very big strategic vulnerability for the Chinese. So for them, it's a very good partnership. It's not equal at all. China is a significantly bigger power than Russia, both when it comes militarily, in manpower, economics. The only thing that they're not bigger than in Russia is probably their nuclear forces. But even when it comes to that, China has continued on a massive buildup of respective elements of the nuclear triad. So they've now gone down and doubled down on their H-6 bomber, which has been much talked about. We still really don't know the specifics, but it will be a part of their nuclear triad. They're also building silos in the middle of the desert. And at the same time, Chinese shipyards are pouring out a bunch of naval vessels, which include ballistic missile capable submarines. So we have to look at this, but yet again, it's not the position of NATO, but rather the member states that constitute NATO on a more bilateral or multilateral level, possibly adjacent to NATO, should raise concern for Chinese activities. But to summarize it in a nutshell, it's not NATO's place to go out seeking conflict with China. It is perfectly situated to highlight the issues that we already have with China in Europe, within the alliance, within this direct sphere of the alliance. But outside that, it is up to the member states, and I think, as a personal opinion, a majority up to the United States to counter with their regional allies, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the first island chain, and then through the second island chain to constrain the Chinese. But that's yet again down to the US. It's not really within the NATO competencies, I think, both when we look at it legally or when we look at it realistically. I don't think it's something that NATO could even accomplish. Would they wish to do it? And yet again, to second what Michael said, I think it would greatly disturb the cohesion of the alliance. There would be a confusion on the mission. And just to go back to what I said earlier, now NATO has a mission. There is a credible threat to the East, and that has to be countered. NATO has a purpose. There's no reason to unnecessarily convolute it when the force structure of the collective West has already been, in some sense, been delegated when we look back to the areas of responsibilities during the Cold War period. The Pacific region was mainly dominated by the United States and with her allies. And while we look at Europe, that was a cooperative sphere, yet again dominated by the United States. But now that isn't the reality anymore with an enlarged European Union and more member states, which used to belong to the Eastern Bloc. So that's an area in which they can cooperate with. And it can also give an EU a little bit more of a purpose when we look at security to make it more European. But yes, so China, I don't think is for NATO.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is really tough topic. But as you both of you mentioned, important is that we use our intelligence to counter this influence. And I'd like to underline what Benjamin just said, that we need to remember that in partnership between China and Russia, China is the bigger partner now, and China is the leading one as for now. And with that question, Michael, Benjamin, we've come to the end of our today's discussion. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you once again for being today on board with me and sharing your views to our observers on the matter of NATO 2024 Summit. So thank you very much once again. And I highly recommend our viewers to follow our next publications, our next events, and our next articles. Thank you very much once again, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you, Mate. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.